So I've lived in London most of my grown-up life.
And I think he should apologise.
It's very different today, isn't it? Today, both the main parties believe that the poor should be tied up in a bin bag and thrown into a canal. The Conservatives, to be fair to them, at least had the guts to look as if they mean that.
I promised you blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And your untiring response brought us, in the end, victory.
Does that matter? Yes, it does. Because our beliefs are different from Labour.
We will set tough rules for public spending and borrowing and ensure low inflation, strengthening the economy so that interest rates are as low as possible.
Doublespeak is language designed to evade responsibility, make the unpleasant appear pleasant, the unattractive appear attractive. Basically, it's language that pretends to communicate but really doesn't. It is language designed to mislead while pretending not to.
I don't want that. Do you?
I think the government would not at all argue that its policy had been intended to increase social exclusion. It would argue perhaps that the position might have been worse if it had not liberalised the labour market and if the trades unions had remained strong. It has been more concerned, for instance, to keep down the level of government spending so that the level of taxation can be kept down. And again, it sees that as being part of that a low level of taxation will bring benefits to the enterprise economy. It will make it easier for firms to make profits and to reinvest them, and therefore in the long run to create employment which will benefit the whole community.
And for 20 years, those Kremlin-approved oligarchs have been coming here to invest their ill-gotten gains via a loophole that allows people to buy property in the UK anonymously.
These are homes valued at tens of millions of pounds, a cluster of Russian jewels.
But I think this has been called, one of the names that has been given to this is the trickle-down theory, that if things go well at the top, then eventually the benefits of that will trickle down to the bottom. Well, I think what is now very clear from the statistics we have on what's happened in Britain since the late 1970s is that that has not yet happened.
Although the number of poorly educated, unemployed people is still rising, the British government keeps cutting down on welfare budgets.
Whether we go down the route to a federal Europe or whether we say no.
Immigration is a big issue. In a recent poll, it topped the list of the most important issues facing Britain. But what evidence do we have about its impact?
In the last few years, slavery has returned to Britain after an absence lasting centuries.
In Britain, the situation was different from the plantation because the idea of a freeborn Englishman who should not be subject to arbitrary cruelties was very alive in the 18th century. It may not have been alive in the colonies, but it was very much part of the notion of being an Englishman.
Still, that too was a long time ago, wasn't it? Of course, slavery is still being practised in the city, but the problem is that it's being operated now by foreigners, and because they don't wish to appear xenophobic, most left-wing liberals would prefer to turn a blind eye to it. After all, if they start complaining about what Eastern Europeans are currently up to in Bristol, then they might come across as Brexit supporters, and that would never do.
I don't believe a federal Europe is right for Britain. I shall say no. Mr. Blair will say yes.
It is all in the hands of foreigners, in the latest case Slovakians, but of course Arabs, Albanians, Chinese and Bangladeshis are all up to the same game in this country. These people imported men, 10 of them from their own country, and then terrorised them into working for them, locking them in a house and hitting them if they objected. They are slaves, or they were slaves until they were freed by the police. These two dreadful people have just been convicted of human trafficking and keeping slaves in Bristol over the last few years. Do you think that it ever occurs to all those white liberals who are agonising over slavery that if they really cared about such things, they could fight against slavery and human trafficking, which is going on in Britain right now, in the present day? I somehow doubt it. For one thing, these slaves are not black, so they were not getting any anti-racist credit for fighting against this vile trade. Then too, as I said, those carrying on the slave trade in this country today are foreigners, and this is a little delicate because nobody wants to look xenophobic or like a Brexiteer. Right there is the problem with left-wing anti-racists. More concerned with dead people than the living, and only interested if black people are obviously the victims and white British people are the villains. In a case where foreigners are the villains and the victims are white, they will show no interest at all.
We should say no to it, and I will. And once gone, they'd be gone for good. Friction with Westminster would be followed by fracture from Westminster.
Here, wealth was the great divide. Money mattered, colour did not. Society frowned far more on mixing between different classes than between different races.
At all levels of society, there were voluntary associations between black people and white people. At the level of the aristocracy, for example, you have the famous case of Soubise, the servant of the Duchess of Queensberry, who was a man of great flamboyance, a youth of great flamboyance, very handsome. All the kitchen wenches wanted him. But he also had this relationship, which became a scandal at the time, with the Duchess.
Now that sounds very cosy, doesn't it?
Welcome to Londongrad, Moscow-on-Thames. 87,000 homes in Britain were bought through offshore companies by anonymous millionaires. At least £1.5 billion worth of those are owned by Russians with direct links to the Kremlin. London is the money laundering capital of the world, bar none. What an accolade!
The first thing we know is that the number of immigrants has been increasing, and they are now about 8 million people. Just under half of new immigrants are from the European Union. Most of these come here to work. Most immigrants from outside the European Union come here to study.
The Scots, the Welsh are proud nation states. But devolution will weaken the whole United Kingdom. Let me explain why.
This June will mark the 250th anniversary of the Mansfield Judgment, which ruled that slavery was not something to be tolerated in this country. But it has crept back and become established once more under the cover of multiculturalism.
The London Laundromat, a one-stop corruption shop for anyone who needs to hide their money away with no questions asked. We have let it happen for years because it's how the UK makes money. It's the only industry we have left.
This is insanity. I'm a taxpayer.
At the same time, immigrants create new jobs by setting up their own businesses and by spending the money they earn.
And they too were keeping slaves. It was quite a big racket. At the time, it was estimated there could be as many as 10,000 slaves in the country, and it was hinted that some other travellers' camps might be centres for this awful trade in humans. That's 2 cases of slavery involving gypsies. Are there any more? Actually, there's quite a few in this country, but because those involved are from Poland, Slovakia, Ireland and other countries, it is not immediately apparent that gypsies are behind much of what is going on. Last year, a man called Demeter and a woman called Demeterova were jailed in Birmingham for a large-scale slavery operation in which people were working for 12 hours a day and ending up being paid £20 a week for their labour. There was a similar case last year in Stoke-on-Trent in which a man called Robert Zaladuk and a woman called Katerina Zaladikova were charged with slavery offences. Once again, these are gypsy names, although both were from Slovakia. Polish gypsies too are mixed up in slavery in Britain. Only last week, 2 Polish gypsies were convicted at Wood Green Court in London of keeping a slave and making her sleep in the garden shed. They were sent to prison for 9 years. I knew, of course, that Irish gypsies had been mixed up in this terrible business, but I had no idea at all that it was also Polish and Slovakian ones as well.
Our aim is rising prosperity for all in a stable, low-inflation economy.
I'm passionately believe that we're right to be in Europe, that our jobs and our prosperity depend upon our trade with it. The question is, what sort of Europe?
The flags were planted here. And the Germans and the French and the British were roaming all over here. And they were firing on each other out of the various forts and so on.
Is that wise? Do you think that's sensible? I don't. But that's Labour policy. And we should say no to something else.
The evidence shows that immigration is overall a good thing for the British economy, although there are winners and losers.
Without it, we'd just be a car park for France. Open Britain, where anyone, arms dealer, drug dealer, people trafficker, warlord, or in this case, hundreds of Kremlin-backed millionaires can rinse their dirty money clean by buying up the most expensive houses in London. And, for the most part, leaving them empty, which inflates the market so much that the rest of us have to sell a kidney just to buy a shed.
I'm putting the card into the machine. Now I've got some electricity. This is based on something that's called a budget scheme. Yeah, I'll be out of electricity until I'm able to get the token to put in. There's nothing else I can do.
In Great Britain, the income of parents is of crucial importance for the education of children. High-income families can offer their children better education and better chances for the future. The British can choose between private schools and state schools. Private schools are for many people an unreachable dream.
It's just unreal.
The low pay policy has been crucial for the British Conservative government, but this policy and the belief in the free market system don't offer more jobs, according to Chris Pond, president of the study bureau, the Low Pay Unit in London.
The British government believes that the free market, unregulated markets, are the best way to compete in the world and to create jobs.
Mansfield agonised for 7 months between equally unpalatable alternatives, challenging an Englishman's property rights or allowing slavery on British soil.
He gave his judgment to the effect that the air of England was too pure to be breathed by a slave. And he ended up, let the black go free, which may not be politically correct, but was a splendid demonstration of his feelings.
In short, in 1772 there was a famous court ruling in London known as the Mansfield case, in which slavery was ruled to be illegal in this country.
Run away sometime since, a Negro lad about 18 years of age answers to the name of Starling, now the property of Ralph Cook at the sign of the Rising Sun in Princes Street, Bristol. Whoever shall harbour or conceal the said black will be prosecuted as the law directs. But any person who will secure him and give notice to his said master Ralph Cook shall receive 1 guinea reward.
Once caught, runaways could be returned by force to their masters. The capture of one former slave was witnessed by a pioneer abolitionist, Granville Sharp.
Granville Sharp, who had nothing to do with slavery, comes across a black boy in the streets who's badly beaten up and makes a simple inquiry, which is like, what's happened? And gets the story. And when he understands the cruelty endured, the suffering endured by ordinary black people in this country at the hands of cruel masters, he decides, like any decent Englishman or Christian to do something about it. And he spends the rest of his life campaigning for the end of the slave trade.
Sharp managed to prevent the ship's captain from taking the boy, James Somerset, back on board. According to law, he was just a piece of property, but Sharp took his case to court, arguing that Somerset should be a free man. The case went to the country's top judge, Lord Chief Justice Mansfield, a Scottish landowner.
He'll hand those key decisions to Brussels to be taken collectively by our partners, perhaps against our wishes and against the vote of the British government.
One of the things which I found hugely entertaining was the complete ignorance of slavery in Bristol before and after the transatlantic slave trade.
Despite earlier pledges from the government to learn lessons and protect the vulnerable, what we need is change now.
If it did not concern black people, nobody was interested. The fact is that Bristol was the centre of the slave trade during the Anglo-Saxon period, 500 years before the start of the slave trade between Africa and North America, and about 700 years before Edward Colston, the man whose statue was thrown in the harbour at Bristol, was even born.
The old concepts of fighting big tank battles on European landmass are over.
That aged well.
For almost 250 years, there was no slavery in Britain. But now, with the arrival of almost unrestricted immigration, the practice has returned and is largely associated with gypsies. This is all very odd, and I will freely confess that I didn't know about it until somebody explained to me the significance.
Immigrants also enable employers to recruit to less desirable jobs, sometimes allowing British workers to carry out better paid and more desirable tasks.
These choices, these crucial decisions...
It's also said that immigrants are a drain on our health service. No one knows exactly how much immigrants cost the NHS.
The hypocrisy of these people is shocking.
And with 26% of doctors born outside the UK, you are more likely to be treated by an immigrant than meet one in the waiting room.
They're not in the far distance, they're for now.
The question is whether government and policy can limit the negative impacts of immigration and spread the benefits. This might take a bit of working out.
The abolitionists knew that their case had to reach many people who could barely read. They used methods that would be recognized today. Their slogan was taken up everywhere.
That was what was needed at the time. A simple appeal using one image which was instantly recognizable and, if you like, a soundbite. Am I not a man and a brother?
Because remember this, splitting the United Kingdom into bite-sized bits would make it more difficult for us to win arguments in Europe and in the wider world.
These are the issues that matter to you. They're the issues that matter to me too. Mine is the first generation to grow up not knowing if our children will be better off than we are.
So I lost my son in November 2017. He was 18 years old, he was stabbed 8 times.
My son was 19 when he was murdered on the estate that he grew up in.
Sammy, he's my only son. He was 18 years old and he got stabbed on his way back from watching West Ham.
Please focus on them. Think about them. Decide what you believe's right for our country. Don't delay. Wait a week, and it will be too late. It's taken years to build up Britain's prosperity. Don't throw it away.
Today, we still have tears. Not so many, thank God. But the conquest of our American allies is a formidable undertaking which we must and will see through to the end. And we must still look forward.
What will happen if Labour win the next election?
What sort of a democracy turns a blind eye?
What kind of country?
But shame on us! What kind of a democracy allows itself to be willingly undermined by a dictator?
What kind of country?
Refreshment from start to finish.
The finding of truth and freedom.
If you want to change something, you have to be a part of something. You have to get involved, you have to educate yourself on it, and you have to make a change from inside. It's all good and well having opinions saying no one listens, but if you're not there to be listened to, who's going to listen?